Mini PCs often prioritize form over function. Low profiles and small footprints are highly appealing in a mini PC, but this dedication to the Intel NUC-style form factor usually means brands have to compromise on power and thermal limits. This new Corebox 5th from Chuwi isn't quite so committed to being the smallest, most powerful mini PC ever, which allows its 13th Gen i5 a little more breathing room. Let's see what it can do with it. For a mini PC, the Corebox 5th is quite large. Don't get me wrong, at 18 by 16 by 8 centimeters, it's still smaller than the box some desktop CPUs ship in, but compared to the NUC-like units with a 12 by 12 centimeter footprint, it's positively huge. Nevertheless, it is still a mini PC, small enough to bolt to a Visa bracket or sit unobtrusively on your desktop. In fact, due to its desktop PC-like aesthetic, you could pair it with a 7-inch monitor and some miniature peripherals and play the classic Gulliver's Travels prank on your friends and family. There are plenty of upshots to having all this extra space, but the one that Chuwi seems to have focused on with the 5th is thermals. The 12-core 16-thread CPU is being kept cool under what Chuwi calls an ITX heatsink. That name would imply that it was designed to use with desktop-class CPUs, so pairing a nominally 45-watt CPU with a cooler designed for much higher wattage parts allows them to stretch the capabilities of the i5-13500H. While this isn't an overclockable part, the TDP has been configured up to 65 watts to help it reach and maintain higher boost frequencies, though the TJ Max appears to have been dropped to about 91 degrees from the stock 100, which, while I don't disapprove, would seem to indicate Chuwi isn't fully leaning on their hefty cooler to keep temps down. Alongside the heatsink, there are two SODIMM slots for user-replaceable DDR5 RAM, one of which comes populated with a 16GB 5200 speed module. Now, DDR5 is inherently dual-channel on a single stick, but those channels are only 32 bits wide compared to 64 bits on DDR4, and by populating only one slot, there will still be some performance left on the table. Nevertheless, this is how Chuwi supplied it, so this is how I'll be testing, for better or worse. The included SSD is a 512GB Gen 4 NVMe drive, and is occupying the only available slot for internal storage. There is a SATA data socket and a header for a power cable, but those are not included, and there isn't really any room to install a 2.5-inch drive anyway, thanks to the oversized cooler. This means that, realistically, most users will be looking to external storage for expansion. That means connectivity is important, and thankfully Chuwi have thought to include plenty of ports. There are 6 external USB 3 Type A holes, 2 on the front and 4 on the back. A single 2.5GB Ethernet port, a whopping 4 display outputs, 2 DisplayPorts, 2 HDMI 2s, all full size, as well as a rear audio jack and DC power port. And on the front, next to the A-holes, we have a Type-C, though alas, it is only USB 3, not Thunderbolt or any other high bandwidth standard, so I don't think it'll be up to the challenge of running an eGPU. Wireless connectivity is in the form of an Intel AX201 card, providing Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.2. Feature-wise then, it's a pretty complete package, with the only real deficit compared to other high-performance mini PCs being the lack of cores on the i5 compared to an i7 or i9. But of course, that also gives the Corebox its second big advantage: price. The 5th sells for $499 on Chuwi's site, or about £410 or €470. That's a good $200 to $300 less than the i9 machine I reviewed recently, and unless you absolutely need the specific features like the extra M.2 slot, the Thunderbolt port or the NUC form factor, the only thing that can justify that huge price difference is performance. And on that subject, starting with a few synthetics, and now that I've tested a couple of similar units, I have a little context for how this i5 performs. The CPU-Z single-core score of 732.6 is only 40 points, or about 6% less than the i9-13900H in the Geekom I tested the other week, and about 75 points better than the Ryzen 7 7840HS in the Beelink Seer 7. The multi-core score of about 60-70 is less than 10% down from both the i9 and Ryzen 7, which have 6 and 8 performance cores respectively. This isn't too surprising when compared to the Ryzen, but the very strong result compared to the i9 has a bit of a backstory. Over 10 separate tests, the i9 score dropped from well over 7k to barely 6 thanks to thermal and power limit throttling, so I took an average of those 10 runs for this comparison. On the other hand, the i5 and Ryzen didn't throttle at all during similar testing. The Cinebench 10-minute test was less favourable for the Chuwi in single core, as it fell 100 points behind the Ryzen and almost 300 behind the i9. However, the multi-thread testing was not kind to the i9, and the i5 actually beats it by almost 1900 points. While this test is only synthetic, it is reflective of how an i5 can sometimes beat an i9 in thermal and power limited scenarios. Geekbench 6 once more favours the higher core counts of the i9 and Ryzen 7, with the i5 losing by a big margin. The Corebox trails the others by between 16 and 21%. In the OpenCL tests, the i5 trails the i9 by 22%, and in Vulkan it loses out by 26%. The B-Link's 780M graphics aren't exactly a fair comparison, scoring 146% higher in OpenCL and 120% higher in Vulkan. In the 3D Mark tests, the Chuwi does really quite well. The CPU score of 8963 just beats the i9 in Time Spy, and at 24k the i5 wins by a similar margin in Firestrike. It also comes in less than 15% behind the Ryzen, which, considering that chip has the same number of threads but double the performance cores, is not bad going. The graphics scores are a completely different story, of course, with the i5's 80 execution units falling behind the others. Moving on to something a little more practical, Resolve Studio can play back 4K H.265 long GOP footage flawlessly, just as the other more expensive units do. Also, like the more expensive units, it struggles with playing back complex transitions and layering. If you want to use one of these for day-to-day editing, it is possible, but if you use a lot of these effects, you'll want to get into the habit of using optimized or transcoded footage, and that will mean upgrading your storage. The render time for a 5-minute 4K H.264 video using QuickSync is 19 minutes 22 seconds, about 3 minutes behind the i9. The H.265 render completed in 19 minutes 11, again a similar margin to the i9, and both are a long way behind the Ryzen's sub 9 minute turnaround. The CPU render time is mostly irrelevant, at least for anyone making content for online consumption, but for sake of completeness, the i5 finished in just under 21 minutes, 2 minutes behind the i9 and exactly 10 minutes behind the Ryzen. Although I expected the B-Link's Radeon graphics to win in GPU rendering, I'm actually kinda surprised how poorly the Intel CPU threads compare here. Though, for a little irrelevant but interesting context, this is still about 7 minutes faster than an old desktop i7 6700K. The Blender classroom scene can only render on the CPU, as the integrated graphics are of no help here. The Chuwi comes out looking pretty good in this test, beating the i9 in the Geekon by about a minute, though at 7 minutes 20, it's still a minute and a half slower than the B-Link. Some more useless context, in my CPU test recently, the desktop Ryzen 5 5600X took 8 minutes 10 to render this scene, though, to be fair, you could always just plug in a GeForce or Quadro and burn through it in a couple of minutes. Apex Legends kicks off the gaming tests, and the Iris Xe in the Chuwi isn't quite up to the task of smooth 1080p gameplay. Averages are in the high 40s, which wouldn't be ideal on its own, but 1% lows are only 20 FPS. 900p was much more acceptable. At minimum settings, it can run at 64 FPS with 1% lows of 43. Battlebit Remastered is one of the lightest weight shooters out there, and the XE graphics have very little problem with it. At 1080 potato settings, the average exceeds 100 FPS, with 1% lows close to 70. This is about 16 to 17% lower than the i9's 96 EU version at the same settings. Counter-Strike 2 still works out okay at 1080p, though gameplay won't be smooth enough for more competitive players. I saw an average of 69 FPS, but lows weren't quite so nice, being a paltry 38. Both of the Intel iGPUs I've tested so far have been somewhat lacking in decent speed memory, with the i9 running on dual-channel DDR4 3200 and this i5 on 32-bit DDR5 5200. Maybe I'll look into a memory upgrade in the future. Fortnite is... well, it's Fortnite. You know how it goes by now. 1% and 0.1% lows are barely acceptable, but you don't know if that's down to the hardware or just the game. And maybe if you play long enough, the stutters will iron themselves out. Still, 80 plus FPS in 1080p performance mode is actually within margin of error of the i9, so this isn't a bad result by any means. Overwatch 2 was way worse than I expected at 1080p low, with unacceptable 1% and 0.1% lows, despite the apparently decent average. At 900p things clear up a bit, but still don't look good on the frame time graph. Averages hit 90, but lows are in the 30s. AAA games aren't the intended use case for this mini PC, but Forza Horizon 5 scales pretty well with less potent GPUs. At 1080 low, things are fairly playable at 34 FPS, though sub 30 minimums aren't ideal. If you prefer, you can turn up to medium and throw on some quality FSR for a roughly 10% drop in frame rates, but a slightly nicer image. Compared to the i9, there's as small a difference in performance as you'd expect. The Ryzen gets double the frame rate at high as the i5 does at low, so again, not a fair comparison. I'm working on an idea for a video about classic games on modern hardware, and I thought I'd get some practice in with the 2007 optimization nightmare, Crysis. At 1080p medium, the average is a quite impressive 85 FPS, though there were a couple of stutters, and it wasn't the game loading or auto-saving, it was an actual dip in performance due to the hardware. Still, at 85 FPS, you might think you'd have room to jump to high, and you'd be dead wrong. The step up to high introduces a ton of frame time spikes and brief pauses when doing stuff like aiming down sights. Just goes to show, even in 2023, that tired 17-year-old meme still has legs. Finally, Civilization VI's AI benchmark has yet to return an impressive result from any mini PC I've tested, and I'm afraid the Chuwi is no different. For whatever reason, the i5 13500H, along with the i9 13900H and Ryzen 7 7840HS, all complete the AI test with a turn time of around the 7.7 to 7.8 second mark. This is embarrassing. Haswell i5s are better at Civ 6 than this. A modern desktop CPU could conquer the world while these chips are still inventing the steam engine. When I first received the Corebox 5th, I wasn't sure what to expect. I hoped that the extra size and the bigger heatsink that it allows for would help it at least compete with the i9 in the Geekom IT13, and in many instances it can clearly do exactly that. For everyday use, video playback, light creative work, maybe media or file server duties, this is every bit as competent as a thermally constricted i9. Anything involving the GPU is still going to perform a little slower, but neither of these is a gaming beast and shouldn't be treated as such. If you want gaming performance in a mini PC, the Ryzen 7000 series remains unchallenged, and the only way that's going to change is if Intel start putting Battlemage GPUs on board. On the subject of GPUs, however, some of the cut corners in the Corebox might be of concern to mini PC enthusiasts, especially if you are considering pairing it with an external GPU. The lack of Thunderbolt means that consumer eGPUs and housings are mostly out of the question, and the lack of a spare M.2 slot and the need for extra cables to install a SATA drive mean that using a DIY external graphics solution is going to require jumping through some hoops. The key takeaway for me, though, is that the Corebox very clearly puts to bed any ideas of $800 i9 mini PCs, because an i5 alternative can have an average of 89% of the performance for about 60% of the price. and with a significantly lower risk of cooking itself in the process. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.